Welcome to Westwind Tales, where we bring you stories from the heart of the Old West. Tales of cowboys and courage, love forged on the open prairie, the unbreakable bond between parent and child, and the quiet compassion between strangers who choose to see each other for who they really are. A woman sits alone where three roads split apart under the blazing Texas sun. There's a cheap silver ring lying in the dust behind her, and she doesn't even look back at it. She's got 19 cents in her pocket, a dead father's watch, and absolutely no idea which road to take. Then a wagon comes around the bend with a broken wheel. Now, what she does next doesn't just save that stranger's ride. It changes everything. Her name, her future, and what it means to truly own something in this world. But here's the thing. This isn't a love story. Not the kind you're thinking of. This is about a woman who stopped waiting to be rescued and started building something with her own two hands. And what she builds, you won't see it coming. This story reminds us that the strongest partnerships aren't built on promises. They're built on respect, hard work, and two people willing to stand side by side as equals. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community. If that sounds like a story worth hearing, stay with us till the very end. Drop a comment and tell us. Have you ever stood at your own crossroads and found something unexpected? Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. Now, let's ride.
When you see a woman sitting all by her lonesome where the road forks, you can bet your boots that things went sideways long before she got there. Now, this ain't just a story about how she got left behind. That part's just setting the scene. This is about the moment she quit looking over her shoulder for someone who was never coming back and started fixing the mess right in front of her. Sometimes the best turns in life don't happen because you had a perfect map. They happen because you know how to get back on your feet when the wagon throws a wheel. Sarah let the ring drop into the Texas dust and didn't even bother to see where it landed. That little silver band, which was supposed to be gold like he promised, flashed once in the high noon sun and then vanished in the ruts. Her hands wanted to shake, but she wouldn't let them. Three roads stretched out before her. North to the hill country, east to more wide-open prairie, and south back to that town where his mother had looked down her nose and called her common. The heavy carpet bag rested by her boots. It held every last thing she owned: 2 dresses, her daddy's pocket watch, and a tin of his old work buttons. For 2 solid hours she'd been sitting there, her face sunburnt and her lips cracked where she'd worried them raw. The watch ticked away in her hand, making the same steady sound it made in his blacksmith shop right before the fever took him. Just then a wagon creaked its way around the bend. It was a fancy buckboard pulled by a fine black gelding, but it was leaning hard to one side. The wheel was carving a deep, crooked line in the dirt. Now, if you've ever found yourself stuck at a fork in the road with a tough choice to make, go on and leave a comment telling us where you're listening from, because the folks who really get a tale like this are the ones who've been there themselves. Sarah stood up and walked toward that buckboard, her boots quiet in the thick dust. The man jumped when she spoke up. "Your kingpin's cracked. You keep on like that. The whole axle's gonna shear off." He just gawked at her. Sweat stained the collar of his shirt and trickled down from his hairline. This is no place for a lady on her own. She paid him no mind. She knelt by the busted wheel. The iron rim was hot enough to scorch her dress. She ran a hand over the hub, feeling for the weakness where wood met metal and felt it give. "You got a tool kit." He gestured to a box behind the seat. She lifted the lid. Inside were brand new hammers and wrenches still wrapped in wax paper and grease. A rich fella's set for sure. Looked like they'd never seen a lick of work. "These'll do." He didn't say a word. She fished out what she needed: a solid iron tent stake, his leather belt. She hitched up her skirt. The petticoat underneath was already torn and filthy from her walk, so she ripped off a long strip. The sound of the muslin tearing cut right through the quiet afternoon. Hold this wheel steady, both hands now, and don't you let it move an inch. He crouched down next to her so close she could smell the horse and sweat on him. His shadow fell over her hands as she worked. She moved with a purpose, bracing the stake along the crack in the kingpin, then cinching his belt around the whole thing. It was good leather, worn soft, right where it usually sat on his waist. She tied the whole works together with the strip of cloth. Pull. Harder. Where in the world did you learn and hold it steady? She pulled the knot tight. Her hands were now covered in black axle grease, the very same grime her daddy used to have under his nails every blessed day. She could almost smell his shop again, the scent of iron, coal smoke, and the sharp bite of hot metal. She stood up, wiping her palms on her skirt. The cream-colored calico was a lost cause anyway. He tested the wheel, nudging the wagon forward about 3 feet. The patch held firm. He turned to thank her, but she was already walking away. "Hold on." He grabbed a canteen and offered it to her. She took it without a word of thanks. The water was lukewarm and tasted of tin, but it was wet. She took 3 long gulps and handed it back. "My father ran a shop." She wasn't sure why she told him that. "He fixed things." His eyes traveled from her face down to her dress, taking in the ragged hem, the missing buttons, and the fresh grease stains. Then his gaze came right back to hers. He had a question on his lips. She could see it plain as day, but he swallowed it. "You need a lift somewhere." He asked which way she was headed. Sarah glanced at the 3 roads stretching out before her. Nothing but dust, tall grass, and shimmering heat no matter which way you looked. She'd been sitting at this fork in the road for 2 solid hours before he showed up. She hadn't been able to decide. Still couldn't. Don't know yet. The words came out flat, but they were the honest-to-God truth. He shifted his weight, and the buckboard creaked. His eyes moved from her face to her carpet bag, then back to the 3 roads. Finally, his gaze landed on her left hand. He'd forgotten about her ring finger. The skin there was pale, a thin white line where that silver ring had sat for 3 long months. "You got family around here?" "No." Just that one word. Flat and final. Her throat was still scratchy with dust. He looked off at the horizon instead of at her. "I could use a housekeeper. The last one up and quit. Said the ranch was a world away from town." He paused for a moment. She wasn't wrong. Sarah's hands were still caked with grease. She rubbed her thumb across her palm. This kind of grime wouldn't come off without some harsh lye soap. "What's it pay?" He turned, looking a little surprised she'd even ask. $20 a month. She did the math in her head. It was the same wage her daddy paid his apprentice. Better than sewing, but not as good as cooking in some fancy hotel. "A room of my own." "Yes. I run the household." "Yes. And if I decide to go, I just go." "That's right." He finally met her gaze head on. His eyes were a pale gray, almost like a stormy sky. "Look, I'm not hiring someone to hang curtains or tell me which fork to use. The last one who tried that made us both about as happy as a cat in a room full of rocking chairs." Sarah's fingers found the one good button left at her collar. A simple bone button her mama had sewn on good and tight. Wouldn't know the first thing about any of that anyhow. Something in his face eased up. It wasn't quite a smile, but the hard line of his mouth softened. How far? 3 hours. She glanced back the way she came. She could just make out that ring, a tiny glint of sunlight in the dirt. Plated silver, not the real thing. It might fetch $2 in the next town if she was lucky. Probably less. Her father's watch ticked away in her dress pocket. She could feel its steady weight against her hip, dependable and true. It was about the only thing he'd left her, aside from his worn leather apron and the understanding of what iron does under fire. Without another word, she grabbed her carpet bag, marched over to that buckboard, and pulled herself up. The leather seat burned right through her dress, cracked and worn, but plenty wide for 2. She settled on the right side, placing the bag at her feet. The brass buckles clinked together. He just stood there a second, staring at her sitting in his wagon like he couldn't quite believe his own eyes. Then he gave a single sharp nod and climbed up next to her. The wagon seat groaned under his weight. She felt the whole thing shift. He gathered the reins, the leather dark and smooth where his hands always held them. A click of his tongue set the gelding in motion. The wagon lurched forward. That patched-up wheel was holding steady. Sarah kept her eyes fixed straight ahead. She didn't look back at the fork in the road, and she sure didn't look back at that ring. But she felt it. She knew the exact moment their shadow passed over that little piece of cheap silver lying worthless in the dust. The open prairie spread out in every direction. It was a whole lot of nothing but grass, sky, and shimmering heat. Not a tree, not a house, not another soul in sight. It was just the two of them, with only the creak of the wheel, the plodding of the gelding's hooves, and the jingle of the harness for company. The sun was well past noon, beginning its long slide west. She figured it was about 2 o'clock. 3 hours from now would get them to the ranch around 5, well before sundown. That was something, at least. She glanced down at her hands, still black. Grease was wedged under her fingernails and etched into every line on her palms. Her daddy's hands had looked just the same, every single day, right up until the sickness took him. She remembered washing them after he passed, scrubbing with lye soap and a stiff brush until her own skin was raw. But the grease never truly came clean, not even then. The iron had left its mark on him for good. The fella next to her hadn't given his name. She hadn't given hers either. They rode on without a word between them as the wagon swayed over the rough ground. The prairie grass rippled in the wind, golden green and waist-high in some spots, its seed heads heavy. After what felt like an hour, he finally spoke. "Name's Silas." She let the name hang in the air for a moment. "Sarah." He just nodded. Didn't press for more and didn't offer anything else himself. The silence settled back in. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the prairie. Sarah's back ached from sitting so stiff and proper. She finally allowed herself to lean back just a little. The buckboard seat was far from comfortable, but it beat the heck out of standing back at that crossroads. It sure beat walking down any one of those 3 roads with nothing but a carpet bag and 19 cents to her name. A knot formed in her stomach. Here she was, heading to a ranch 3 hours from nowhere, with a man whose last name was a mystery, agreeing to live in his house and work for him. Her mama would have called her a fool right to her face, but her daddy, he might have understood. The wheel gave another groan, the very same one she'd patched up with his belt and a piece of her own petticoat. From her seat, she could see the makeshift repair. That leather strap holding the tent stake was all that was keeping the kingpin from busting clean in 2. It was a temporary fix, good for maybe 10 miles, 15 if he took it easy. And Silas was definitely taking it easy. The ranch finally came into view on the horizon, just as the sun was kissing the edge of the world. A white house, a big red barn, a corral, and 3 ranch hands standing by the barn, watching them roll in. They pulled into the yard right as the last sliver of sun disappeared. The house was a simple 2-story white clapboard with paint peeling here and there. It was built to work, not to impress. Behind it stood a large barn, painted a strong red, looking solid with the fresh scent of cedar hanging in the air. Corral had some sturdy fencing. Over by the barn, 3 men quit their work and just stood there, watching the buckboard approach. Silas reined in the gelding, yanking the brake into place. Those men stayed put, their eyes fixed on the wagon. Sarah's grip on her cloth traveling bag grew tighter. Silas swung himself down and started walking toward them. Sarah remained on the buckboard seat, her legs all stiff and tired from sitting for 3 long hours. The worn leather had pressed deep lines into the fabric of her skirt. "That is the new housekeeper," Silas announced, his voice carrying just enough for her to hear. "Miss Sarah." He never used her last name. She herself had only learned his name, Kane, about an hour before when he pointed out the start of his property line. The 3 men gave a slow nod. One of them tipped his hat, revealing a full head of gray hair. All 3 were older men, at least 50, maybe closer to 60. Their faces were weathered like old leather, and their backs were stooped, not at all the young, strong ranch hands she had pictured. They gave her one quick look and then turned right back to their chores. Not a single question, not one word of greeting. Sarah finally climbed down from the wagon. When her boots touched the dusty ground, her knees gave a little wobble, but she forced them to hold steady. Silas untied the gelding and began leading it to the barn, with the three old hands following right behind him. She could hear them talking in low voices, but couldn't make out any of the words. She was left standing alone in the yard with her bag, the farmhouse in front of her, the barn at her back, and the open prairie rolling out in every direction. There were no other buildings anywhere in sight, and the only road was the dirt track they had just bounced along. The front door of the house was wide open, like an invitation. She walked toward it, went up 3 wooden steps, and crossed a porch whose floorboards groaned under her weight. Stepping inside, the dim light of the house was a shock after the bright sunshine. She blinked a few times, letting her eyes adjust. An oak table sat in the middle of the main room, surrounded by 6 ladder-back chairs. Only 4 of the chairs were a set. The other 2 were made of a darker, different kind of wood. A sideboard stood against one wall, holding a stack of clean dishes. There were no curtains on the windows and no cabinets, but the bare wooden floors had been swept clean not long ago. A steep, narrow staircase led to the second floor. "This way," she heard, turning with a start. Silas had slipped in behind her without a sound. He walked past the table, went to a door on the right side of the room, and opened it. The housekeeper's room. Sarah followed him to the doorway. The room was tiny, maybe 10 feet square, with a single window that faced east. An iron bed frame was pushed against the far wall, and that was it. The floor was just bare wood, swept clean, with no rug. "I will have some furniture brought in." He said this while looking at the empty floor, not at her. Sarah set down her traveling bag, and the sound bounced off the empty walls. She walked over to the window and looked out. From there she could see the corrals and the vast prairie beyond. The tall grass was moving in waves, just like water under the wind. "Thank you," she said. Silas just nodded and left, pulling the door shut behind him. Sarah stood there in the silent, empty room. It was the first time she had been by herself in many hours, the first time since leaving the crossroads. She could hear his heavy boots on the wood floor in the other room, and then the creak of the stairs as he went up. She sat down on the edge of the bed frame. The cold iron seeped right through her dress. A tremor started in her hands, and she watched them shake, unable to stop them at first. She finally pressed them down hard against her legs, pushing until the shaking slowed and then stopped completely. She got up and smoothed out her skirt. The black grease stains against the cream-colored fabric were still there. Her hands were still smudged with dirt, and she longed for soap and water. The room felt so large and empty that her own voice would echo if she dared to speak, so she stayed quiet. She opened her bag and looked at her few belongings. 2 dresses, her father's old pocket watch, a small tin of buttons, and his leather apron, which was folded up neatly at the very bottom. She took out the apron and unfolded it. The leather was old and cracked, with little burn marks from the sparks of a forge. It still carried the faint smell of smoke and coal and hot iron. She held it for just a moment before she carefully folded it back up and placed it on the floor next to the bed. Her stomach felt completely empty, a hollow ache inside her. She hadn't had a bite to eat since that morning, just one piece of hardtack at the crossroads, what felt like a lifetime ago. She left the little room, closing the door softly behind her. The main room was much darker now, as the sun had finally dipped below the horizon. A fading orange glow filtered through the windows, but it was vanishing fast. She found the kitchen through a doorway on the other side of the house. A cast-iron stove stood against the wall, still giving off a little warmth when she touched it. A wooden box next to it was filled with split logs. She opened the stove door and saw the red glow of hot coals. She carefully added some small pieces of wood, then a few larger ones. The fire soon caught, and orange flames began to lick upwards. A sideboard held the pantry supplies. There was salt pork in a ceramic crock, some canned tomatoes with a red cross on the label, a cloth sack of flour, a tin of lard, coffee, and salt. She found a heavy pan, cut 3 thick slices of the salt pork, and laid them in the pan on the stove. The meat immediately started to sizzle, and the smell of the rendering grease filled the small kitchen. Her stomach clenched with hunger. She decided to make biscuits, mixing flour, lard, salt, and water from a pump by the sink. She worked the sticky dough with her hands, adding more flour until it was right, then kneaded it on the sideboard. She used the rim of a tin cup to cut out perfect circles, placed them on a flat pan, and slid the pan into the hot oven. Thus, salt pork finished cooking first. She moved it onto a plate, then opened the can of tomatoes and poured them right into the hot grease in the pan, letting them heat up. She heard footsteps coming down the stairs. Silas appeared in the kitchen doorway and stopped. "You did not need to cook." "I was hungry," she answered simply. He nodded and sat down at the table. She realized then that the big oak table from the front room actually stretched all the way into the kitchen area. She pulled the biscuits from the oven, which were perfectly browned on top. She put them on a plate, brought all the food to the table, and set his plate in front of him before going back for her own. They sat at opposite ends of the long table in silence. She began to eat. The salt pork was tough, the biscuits were a bit dry, and the tomatoes were scalding hot. But she did not care one bit. The painful cramping in her stomach finally stopped. Silas took a folded newspaper out of his back pocket. It was the Gazette, and the date on it showed it was 3 days old. He opened it up and began to read as he ate. She watched him for a moment. He turned each page with great care, making precise folds and never crumpling the paper. When he was done reading, he folded it back up exactly the way it had been before. She stood up, gathered their empty plates, and carried them over to the sink. There was a tin basin there, and she pumped cold water into it. The water splashed loudly as she found a rag and began to wash. The light outside was almost completely gone now. Just a sliver of orange remained on the western horizon, visible through the kitchen window. She heard Silas stand up, the sound of his chair scraping against the floor, followed by his footsteps. Suddenly, a warm light blossomed right beside her. He had taken the coal oil lamp from the table and set it on the sideboard next to the sink, close enough for her to see what she was doing. "Thank you," she said. Those were his first words to her since he had mentioned the furniture. She just nodded her head and continued with the dishes. He turned and left, and she heard him climb the stairs again. A door shut somewhere on the second floor. She finished washing the dishes, dried them with a towel she found hanging on a nail, and stacked them neatly back on the sideboard. She wiped down the table, checked the stove, and banked the fire so it would be ready for the morning. The little flame in the lamp flickered in a draft from the window. She picked it up and carried it back to her room, setting it on the floor next to her traveling bag. In the lamplight, the room seemed even smaller, and the shadows in the corners looked deeper. She closed the door. There was no lock, only a simple latch, which she fastened. Then she sat on the cold iron bed frame. She pulled off her worn boots and set them down. Her feet ached terribly. Her stockings were damp with sweat, and she peeled them off. Her feet looked ghostly pale against the dark wooden planks of the floor. She laid herself down on the bare frame. There was no mattress and no blanket, just the hard iron slats. They dug into her back right through the thin fabric of her dress. She shifted her body, trying to find a position that was not painful, but it was no use. The lamp's flame guttered, making the shadows on the walls dance and sway. She stared up at the ceiling, at the bare wooden beams above her. She could see the individual nails, the grain of the wood, and even a spider web tucked away in a corner. The steady ticking of her father's watch in her dress pocket was a small comfort. She pulled it out and opened the silver case. The hands pointed to 8:30. She wound it 13 turns, just as she did every single night. She snapped the case shut and held the cool metal against her chest. The old house groaned around her. It could have been the wind or the house settling, or maybe Silas moving around upstairs. She could not tell for sure. She closed her eyes, then opened them again. The ceiling was still there with its wooden beams and its spider web. She had left her entire old life behind. The town, his family, the church where they were supposed to have been married, and the little room she had rented for 3 months while she planned a wedding that never came to be. And now she was here, in a barren room on a ranch 3 hours from anywhere, working for a man whose last name she had only learned a couple of hours ago. She knew she ought to feel afraid. But as she pressed her father's watch tighter against her heart, all she felt was a quiet, stubborn resolve. She pressed her hand flat against the iron bed frame. It was cold and solid, a hard fact. He had promised furniture would be here tomorrow. She did not know if she could trust his word, but the stove had been warm when she arrived. The floor was swept clean. A neat stack of split firewood sat ready. He was clearly expecting somebody. The real question was if that somebody was her. The rattle of wagon wheels pulled her from sleep. It was still black as pitch outside. Sarah opened her eyes. The ceiling beams were just dark shapes hanging over her. She had probably slept 3 hours, maybe not even that long. The unforgiving iron of the bed frame had left bruises on her shoulders and hips. Every breath was a fresh hurt. She pulled on her gray work dress, the only other dress she owned in this world. She buttoned it up in the darkness. Her fingers knew each button by heart. They were made of bone. 6 of them. All were present. She moved to the window. A covered wagon was parked in the yard, its canvas top like a big white bonnet. 2 men were unloading something from the back. Silas stood nearby, pointing and giving them directions. Sarah walked to the door and lifted the latch. The old hinges gave a loud squeak. She crossed the main room. The floorboards felt cold against her bare feet. She went out the front door, across the porch, and down the steps. The dirt in the yard was cold, too, damp with the night's dew. It clung to the bottoms of her feet. Silas turned and saw her standing there. His eyes flickered down to her bare feet, then came right back up to her face. He said, "I did not mean to wake you." She offered no reply. She just stood there and watched the men lift a large object wrapped in canvas. It was heavy. They hauled it toward the house. Silas trailed right behind them. Sarah remained in the yard. More things started coming out of the wagon. A thick mattress. The ticking fabric was brand new, a creamy white color. A simple washstand made of pine. It had 3 legs. A small wardrobe, also pine. A rug rolled up tight, colored blue and cream. And then, the quilt. One of the men unrolled it to make sure it was not damaged. The pattern made her stop and stare. It was covered in hundreds of small fabric rings, all linked together in a wedding ring design. The colors were a dark blue and cream. It was stitched by hand. Every single piece was cut with precision, and every seam was perfectly straight. She just stared at it. Silas came back outside and saw her looking at it. He said he had ordered it 3 weeks back, that he had been needing to hire someone proper. 3 weeks. That was before his wagon wheel broke, before she found herself stranded at that crossroads, before he had ever laid eyes on her. The timing only made sense if he had sent the order right after his last housekeeper had left. She walked over to the quilt. The man held it out for her. She ran her hand over the fabric. It was good quality cotton. The stitching was tight, with no threads hanging loose. The rings were interlocked in a design that repeated itself, circle after circle after circle, with no end in sight. That is fine work. The man nodded, folded it up with care, and carried it into the house. The 2 men made 4 more trips, bringing every last piece into her room. She stood on the porch and watched them do their work. Silas stood in the doorway, telling them just where to put each piece of furniture. His shoulders were tense, like he was bracing himself for her to say it was all wrong, that she wanted something else entirely. It took them about 20 minutes. When they were all finished, Silas walked them back over to the wagon. He pulled out a leather pouch and counted out coins into each man's hand. They both nodded, climbed up onto the wagon seat, and turned the horses around. The wagon rolled on out of the yard. The sky was getting lighter now. It was not sunrise yet, but it was getting close. It was that gray hour just before the sun finally breaks over the horizon. Silas walked back to the house. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and looked up at her. His face was difficult to read in the dim light. "Do you need anything else?" "No." He gave a nod and headed toward the barn. She watched him walk away. His back was straight. He had a long stride. The three old ranch hands were already awake. She could see them moving around inside the barn. She could hear the sound of hay being pitched with a fork and the soft nickering of the horses. She went back inside to her room and shut the door. The furniture filled up the space, making it feel smaller. The new bed frame was against the wall where the old one had been. The mattress sat on top, so thick that her hands sank right into it when she pressed down. The washstand was placed under the window, with a white porcelain bowl and pitcher sitting on it. They had a blue stripe running around the rim. The wardrobe was against the wall opposite, its doors shut. The rug lay rolled up beside it. The quilt was folded neatly on the bed. Sarah unrolled the rug. She laid it down on the floor next to the bed. It was made of blue and cream strips, braided tightly together, clearly handmade. Someone had spent countless hours cutting up fabric, braiding it, coiling it, and then stitching all those coils together. The colors were a perfect match for the quilt. She lifted the mattress. It was filled with corn husks. She could feel the separate husks moving under her hands and could smell the scent of dry grass. It made a crackling sound when she set it back down. She spread the quilt out over the mattress and smoothed it flat. The wedding ring pattern covered the entire bed, hundreds upon hundreds of rings. She counted 12 across and 15 down, for a total of 180 rings. Each one of those rings was made from about 20 small pieces of fabric. That came out to 3,600 pieces. Someone had cut 3,600 tiny pieces of fabric and stitched them all together with their own hands. She sat down on the bed. The mattress gave way under her, soft. The iron frame was no longer digging into her body. She pressed her palm flat against the quilt. The fabric felt cool and smooth. Wedding rings. She stood up, opened her carpet bag, and pulled out her 2 dresses. She gave them a good shake. Dust puffed out onto the floor. She opened the wardrobe. Inside were wooden pegs for hanging clothes. There was a shelf at the top. She hung up both of her dresses. They looked so small hanging in that empty wardrobe, almost lost. She took out her father's pocket watch and set it on the washstand next to the pitcher. The brass case of the watch caught the gray light of dawn coming in through the window. The tin full of buttons came out next. She opened it. There were bone buttons, pearl buttons, metal buttons, and buttons covered in fabric. Her father had kept them all in a drawer in his workshop. He used them when a customer needed one replaced. She had taken the whole tin after he passed away. She set it right beside the watch. The last thing was his apron. She unfolded it. The leather was stiff and cracked in a few places with burn marks from stray sparks. One of the straps was broken. She had always intended to fix it. She just never had. She looked around the room and found a nail sticking out of the wall next to the wardrobe. It was probably left over from an old picture or a shelf. She hung the apron on it. The leather hung there crooked because of the broken strap, but it was hanging. It was the first thing she had put up. She stepped back and looked at the room. She saw the bed with its beautiful quilt, the washstand with her father's watch and tin of buttons, the wardrobe holding her dresses, the rug on the floor, and the apron on the wall. It looked like a room where someone actually lived. She sat on the bed again and placed her hands in her lap. Her palms were still black with grease from fixing the axle yesterday. She really ought to wash them. Lye soap would get most of it off, but not all of it. Never all of it. Her throat felt tight. She swallowed hard. She swallowed again. Her eyes started to burn. She pressed the heels of her hands against them, pressing so hard that she saw stars behind her eyelids. She dropped her hands. The room was still there. It was all still real. She heard footsteps in the hall. Then a knock on her door. She stood up, smoothed down her dress, and wiped her face with her sleeve, even though no tears had fallen. Yes. The door opened. Silas was standing in the doorway. He did not come inside, he just looked. His eyes moved all around the room, taking in the furniture. He looked at the apron on the wall. Then his gaze returned to her face. If it is not, it is fine. She cut him off before he could say more. She did not let him finish. She could not let him finish. If he said another word, if he offered to change a single thing, she felt like something deep in her chest would crack wide open, and she would never be able to put it back together again. It is better than fine. He just looked at her for a long moment. His face seemed softer than it had yesterday. The hard lines around his mouth were not as deep. Then he just nodded and pulled the door closed. She listened to his footsteps as he walked away. She heard him go down the hall and out the front door. The door shut. She sat back down on the bed. The quilt felt smooth beneath her hands. Wedding rings. Hundreds of them. Not a single one was hers. But all of them meant something entirely different now. The porcelain pitcher on the washstand was full of water. She had not noticed that before. Someone had filled it. This morning, before the sun came up while she was still sleeping on that bare iron frame, she poured some of the cold, clear water into the bowl. She dipped her hands in. The water turned gray, and then it turned black. She scrubbed her palms together, getting under her nails and between her fingers. The water just got darker and darker. The grease finally started to come off. Well, she couldn't wash all of it off. Some of the grit stayed deep in the lines of her hands, down in the cracks around her fingernails. She wiped her hands on her skirt and took a look. Still stained, but better. The little window in her room faced east, and the sun was just starting to peek over the horizon, spilling orange light all across the wide open prairie. She could see for miles and miles, just grass bending in the wind like waves on an ocean. No trees, no buildings, not a single road except for the dirt track that led to this house. There was absolutely nothing standing between her and the edge of the world. She turned back and looked at the room. That morning light hit the quilt on the bed just right. The blue patches looked almost purple and the cream-colored parts looked like pure gold. The wedding ring pattern seemed to glow. Her back was aching something fierce from those iron slats she'd been sleeping on. Her shoulders were bruised up and her hips protested every time she tried to move. She was tired, a deep-down bone tired that a single night of sleep couldn't possibly fix. But now she had a mattress, a real one, and this beautiful quilt, and a room that looked like somebody actually cared if she was here or not. She laid down on her side on that bed and pulled her knees up. The mattress was soft, and the quilt felt smooth against her cheek. She could smell the new fabric, the dried corn husks in the mattress, and the pine wood of the new furniture. Her daddy's watch was ticking on the washstand, a steady, dependable sound, the very same sound it had made in his workshop every single day for 20 years. She closed her eyes, and sleep took her right away. It was a deep, quiet sleep with no dreams. When she finally woke up, the sun was high in the sky. It had to be mid-morning, maybe even later. She could hear voices outside, men talking and laughing. The sound of a hammer hitting a nail like something was being built or mended. She sat up in bed. Her body still hurt, but not nearly as bad. That sleep had done her a world of good. She stood up and looked around the room one more time. In the full light of day, it looked different. It looked real and solid, like it had been sitting here waiting just for her all this time. She walked over to the door and opened it. The house was quiet inside. Silas must have been outside with the other men. She could hear them a little clearer now. They were talking about the north fence, saying the wire needed to be replaced. She made her way to the kitchen and found some bread and butter. She ate standing right there at the sideboard. The bread was from yesterday, and a little hard around the edges, but she didn't mind one bit. After she finished, she went on outside. Silas was over by the barn with 3 of his ranch hands. They were loading tools onto a wagon, things like hammers, wire cutters, and big rolls of barbed wire. He saw her and gave her a nod. She just nodded right back. The whole day was stretched out in front of her. There was work to be done, a household that needed managing, meals that needed cooking, and a whole new life that needed to be built from scratch. She went back inside and started making a list in her head of everything that needed doing, what needed to be organized, and where everything ought to go. But before any of that, there was one thing she had to know. She needed to find out if that furniture, and especially that quilt, had really been ordered 3 weeks ago like he said. Or if he had lied, if he'd just sent for it yesterday after he brought her to this place. Because if he lied about it, that meant something entirely different. It meant he had already made up his mind about her long before she had made up her mind about him, and she just didn't know yet if that was a good thing or a bad thing. 4 weeks went by. Sarah started waking up before him. Every morning she'd come downstairs in the dark, build a fire in the stove while the house was still cold, and set the coffee to boil. The smell of it would fill up the whole kitchen by the time she heard his footsteps creaking on the stairs. He would come in, pour himself a cup, and stand by the stove to warm his hands. She would crack eggs into the frying pan. He would slice the bread. Neither one of them said a word until the sun was fully up. The stove's running low. I'll get some more wood. He would head outside and come back with an armload of split logs. He would stack them neatly in the wood box. She would adjust the damper on the stove, and the fire would catch and burn hotter. They ate their breakfast at the table. He would read the Gazette. She would just watch the light change through the window. When they were all done, she washed the dishes. He dried them. He put the dishes right back on the sideboard, in the exact same spot they were before. After that, he would go out to the barn. She would sweep the floors, go tend to the chickens, and work in the little kitchen garden she had started behind the house. She had brought some basil seedlings from the mercantile on their first trip into town. She transplanted them and added some thyme she'd found. Those little seedlings were starting to take root. 3 inches of green were pushing up right through that black soil. In the afternoon, she would sit on the porch with her sewing basket and mend clothes, his shirts and the ranch hand's trousers. Sometimes he would ride past on his horse, checking on the fence lines or the water troughs. He would give her a nod when he saw her sitting there. She would just nod right back. In the evenings, they would sit on that same porch after the dishes were done. He would smoke his pipe. She would continue her mending. The crickets would get louder and louder as the sun went down. Every now and then he might mention something about cattle prices or say that the north pasture needed burning. She would listen and maybe mention that the hen house door was hanging a little crooked. The very next day, it would be fixed. There was no discussion about it. It was just done. By the 3rd week, she knew which floorboards creaked when you stepped on them, which burner on the stove got the hottest, and exactly how he liked his coffee, black, with 2 cups in the morning and 1 after dinner. She had started buying Arbuckle's coffee at the mercantile. He noticed, but he never said a thing about it. He just drank it. He knew she kept her father's watch on the wash stand, and that she wore her gray dress on Mondays and her cream-colored one on Fridays. Except the cream one was ruined now, so it was just the gray one every single day. He had ordered some fabric from town. He left it right on her bed. It was a brown calico, enough to make 2 new dresses. She had already cut and sewn one of them. It was hanging in the wardrobe right now. She planned on wearing it next week. Their rhythm had settled in, easy and efficient, like 2 people working together at the same forge. One person heats the metal, the other one hammers it, with no wasted motion between them. On the 5th week, on a Tuesday morning, she was cleaning his office. It was a small room just off the main hall with a desk, a chair, a window that faced west, and shelves with ledgers stacked up 3 deep. She was dusting. The dust rag caught on the edge of a ledger and pulled it right off the shelf. It fell to the floor and landed wide open. The pages were full of numbers, written in columns. She glanced at them while she was picking the book up. The numbers just looked wrong. She took a closer look. She added up the first column in her head. The total written at the bottom did not match her own. She checked the next column. It had the same problem. She checked the 3rd one. Wrong again. She carried that ledger into the kitchen and set it on the table. Then she went back for 2 more, spread them all out, and started checking every single line. That night, after the dishes were done, she stayed right there at the table. Silas came in from the porch and saw her with the ledgers spread open, a pen in her hand, an ink bottle at her elbow, a steel nib pen, the same kind her father had always used. She had found it in the desk drawer. "Your books are wrong." He stopped what he was doing and set his pipe down on the sideboard. How wrong, your last bookkeeper couldn't add. She turned one of the ledgers around to face him and pointed at a column. This one says 412, but it should be 398. She pointed at another one. This one says 206. It should be 183. He pulled out a chair and sat down, leaning over the table to see better. His shoulder was almost touching hers. She could smell the pipe tobacco and leather on him, and the dust from his long ride. Can you fix it? Yes. She worked for 3 whole nights. He would bring her coffee without her even asking. He would set it down right beside her elbow, watch her work for a minute or so, and then he would leave. She would hear him go up the stairs, and then the sound of his door closing. She would just keep on working, with the lamp burning low, the pen scratching across the paper, and the India ink staining her fingers black. She reorganized everything from top to bottom. She made new columns for income, expenses, cattle sales separate from feed costs, and wages separate from supplies. She put all the dates in order, with subtotals for every month, and grand totals at the very end. Those numbers told a story. Back in March, he had paid $240 for hay. In April, it was $260. In May, it was $280. It was the same supplier for the same amount of hay, but the price kept climbing 10% each month. $20 here, $20 there, small enough that you might not notice, but big enough to matter over the course of a year. She showed him. This is wrong. He studied the pages for a long time. His finger traced the columns following her work. You're sure? Yes. He rode into town the very next day. He came back at dusk and walked right into the kitchen where she was frying up some pork chops. The grease popped and sizzled in the pan. You were right. The supplier was overcharging me. Said it was all just a mistake. He gave me a credit. How much? $100. She flipped the pork chops over in the pan. A little bit of fat spattered onto the stove. She wiped it clean with a rag. Good. The next morning, there was a brand new ledger sitting on the table. It was bound in leather, with marbled end papers of green and cream. She opened it up. On the very first page, there was writing in black ink. It was his handwriting, neat and slanted to the right. It said, Sarah, Accounts, 1882. She ran her finger over the letters. The ink was already dry. He must have written it last night. After she had gone to bed, after he knew for sure she had saved him money, after he knew she could be trusted with a whole lot more than just cooking and cleaning. She sat down, opened the book to the first blank page, dipped the pen in the ink, and started a new entry. She wrote the date, the income, the expense. Her handwriting was right there next to his on the page. It was smaller and tighter, but it was there, and it was permanent. The evenings started getting longer. After the dishes were done, they would sit out on the porch. He would smoke. She would mend, but the silence between them felt different now. It wasn't uncomfortable, just quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't feel like it needs to be filled up with talk. One night, he was the first one to speak. You ever wonder why I don't live in town? She bit off a piece of thread and started another stitch, mending a tear in the sleeve of his shirt. No. Most men with money do. They have big houses and neighbors and church socials every Sunday. You don't seem to want those things. No. He drew on his pipe and the tobacco inside glowed red in the dark. It's too much of a performance. She looked over at him. He was just staring out at the prairie. The moon was up, full and white. It lit up all the grass and made it look like silver. You mean lying? I mean pretending you're something other than what you are. He tapped the ash from his pipe, wearing all the right clothes, saying all the right things, going to all the right places. All of it is false. All of it is just for show. She nodded and went back to her mending. Her father used to say something like that about iron, how it didn't pretend to be anything, how it just was what it was. Hot or cold, bent or straight, rusted or clean. No performance, no lies. My father used to say, iron doesn't perform, it just is. Silas looked over at her. The smoke from his pipe curled in the air between them and just drifted away. On the night breeze. That is right, they sat. The crickets grew louder. A coyote howled somewhere to the north. Another one answered from far away. The sound drifted across the open prairie. It was a lonely, wild sound. She finished her mending, folded the shirt, and placed it in the basket. "I should get some sleep." He nodded. She stood up and went inside to her room. She closed the door and sat on the bed. The quilt felt smooth under her hands. Wedding rings, hundreds of them. She pressed her palm down flat against the pattern. She could feel the stitching, the careful work. It was someone's time, someone's care, all put into fabric, put into a pattern, made to last for a long, long time. The house creaked. She heard his footsteps on the stairs, then his door closing. She lay down and pulled the quilt up over her. The room was dark except for the moonlight streaming in through the window. She could just make out the shape of her father's apron on the wall. It was crooked because of the broken strap, but it was there, hanging, marking this place as her own. She closed her eyes. Her father's watch ticked away on the washstand. It was a steady, reliable sound, the same rhythm it had always kept. She thought about the ledger with her name on it. The ink was dry now, a permanent mark. She was not just a housekeeper, not just some hired hand, but something more. It was a feeling she could not yet put a name to, but it was real as the ground beneath her feet. Sleep did not come easy that night, but it came. Morning arrived like it always did before the sun. She got the fire going and put the coffee on to brew. Soon he came downstairs. They moved around the kitchen together, falling into their usual routine, their familiar rhythm. But it was different now. Something had clicked into place, like two gears that had been grinding finally found their groove. Everything was running smoother. Everything just felt right. Friday marked the end of her 5th week there. She was out in the garden behind the house. The basil stood a good 6 inches tall, its leaves a deep, healthy green. She was pulling weeds from between the rows. The rich black soil was packed under her fingernails. Her hands carried the scent of crushed sage. She heard the rattle of wagon wheels and looked up. A buggy was making its way down the road. It was a fine buggy with black lacquer paint, yellow wheels, and a red fringe on its canopy. It was far too fancy for a Friday, and much too fine for this part of the ranch country. She stood up, wiping her hands on her apron. As the buggy drew nearer, she saw a woman driving it all by herself. She was dressed way too grand for the morning, in a burgundy dress and a black hat with feathers on the side. A knot tightened in Sarah's chest. She knew that buggy. She had seen it. In town, parked outside the hotel and the mercantile, always looking spotless, always gleaming. The buggy rolled into the yard. The woman spotted Sarah and offered a smile. That smile, though, never made it to her eyes. Mrs. Adelaide Frost had come to pay a visit. The buggy came to a stop. Mrs. Frost climbed down, tied her horse to the porch rail, and smoothed out her skirts. The burgundy fabric seemed to shimmer in the sun. It was expensive, and there was not a speck of road dust on it. Sarah started walking toward the house. Her apron was stained with dirt. Her dress was the simple brown calico Silas had bought for her, practical and plain. Her feet were bare. She had left her boots over by the garden. Mrs. Frost turned and saw her coming. That smile of hers widened a little, but her eyes stayed cold. "You must be the new help," she said. "Not housekeeper, but help." Sarah stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. Her toes were black with the soil from the garden. "Yes, ma'am." "Yes." "I am Adelaide Frost, an old friend of Silas's." She looked Sarah up and down, taking in the dirt-stained apron, the plain dress, the bare feet, and the dark fingernails. How rustic. The word just hung there in the quiet air. Rustic, like Sarah, was just another part of the scenery. Something wild and untamed, maybe not quite human. Sarah's face grew hot with shame. She glanced down at her own feet. The dirt was ground into her skin, under her nails, and between her toes. She looked like a common field hand. Worse, she looked like someone who had never owned a pair of shoes, someone who did not know any better. Mrs. Frost walked right up the steps and onto the porch. Sarah's porch. But it was not, was it? Not really. It was Silas's porch. It was Silas's house. It was Silas's ranch. She just worked here. Is he home? Sarah's throat felt tight. No, ma'am. He is out checking the fence lines. Oh. Mrs. Frost sat herself down in one of the porch chairs, the very one Sarah liked to use for her mending. She arranged her skirts perfectly, keeping them clean. Well, I will just wait then. You do not mind, do you? It was not her porch to mind over. I will make some tea. She went inside. Her bare feet left dirty prints all over the clean floor. She had just swept it that morning. Now it was dirty all over again. Because of her, because she had been working in the garden like hired help, like common labor. In the kitchen, she started to pump some water. Her hands were shaking. The pump handle felt cold in her grip. Water splashed into the kettle, and some of it spilled onto the sideboard. She tried to wipe it up with her apron, but that only left a smear of dirt behind. She found the good china, the set that was kept on the high shelf, white porcelain with delicate blue flowers. She had washed it once and put it away, never having a reason to use it. Now her own dirty hands were touching it, leaving smudges. She tried to wipe the cups with her apron, but that just made it worse. The dirt smeared right across the white porcelain. She set the cups on a tray along with the teapot, the sugar bowl, and the cream pitcher. Her hands would not stop shaking. The china rattled with every move. The kettle began to whistle. She made the tea, let it steep for a moment, and then carried everything out to the porch. The tray felt heavy in her arms, making them tremble. The cups rattled even harder. Mrs. Frost watched as she set it all down. How lovely. Real china. I was not sure Silas even owned any. Sarah started to pour. Her hand shook so much that tea slopped over the rim of Mrs. Frost's cup and into the saucer. Mrs. Frost's eyebrows shot up. She did not say a word. She just watched as Sarah poured her own cup. More tea ended up in that saucer, too. Sarah's face burned even hotter. She sat in the other chair, the one Silas usually sat in. It felt wrong, like it was too big for her, like she was a little girl playing in a grown-up's chair. Mrs. Frost took a sip, made a small, displeased face, and set the cup down. How long have you been here? 5 weeks. My, that is quite a while. Mrs. Frost's eyes traveled over Sarah again, taking in the dirty apron, the plain dress, and her bare feet with their blackened toes. You must find it awfully lonely. Just the two of you way out here. No other women around, no proper company. Sarah's hands tightened around her cup. The porcelain was thin and delicate. She could feel it give way just a little under her fingers. I am not lonely. Of course not. Mrs. Frost smiled that same cold smile. Still, people do talk. You understand? A single woman and a single man, living under the same roof. No chaperone, no family. It is such an unconventional arrangement. That word hit her like a slap in the face. Unconventional. It was just another way of saying wrong, improper, shameful. I am the housekeeper. Oh yes, of course. That is what everyone says. Mrs. Frost picked up her cup again and took a small sip. But you know how these small towns are. People see what they want to see. They make their own assumptions. And when a woman lives alone with a man, she let her voice trail off, letting the ugly implication just hang there in the air. Sarah's stomach twisted into a knot. She knew exactly what Mrs. Frost was saying, what the folks in town were likely saying. That she was his mistress, that she had traded her virtue for a roof over her head and food on the table, that she was no better than she ought to be. Just with a fancier title. I work for him, I am sure you do. Mrs. Frost set her cup down for the last time. It is just such a delicate situation for the both of you. I felt it was my duty as a friend to come and see for myself, to make sure everything was appropriate. Appropriate. Sarah wanted to laugh right in her face. There was nothing appropriate about her. She was a woman all alone, left at a crossroads. She had no family, no references, and no past she could speak of without feeling shame. She had climbed into a stranger's wagon, come to his ranch, and moved right into his house. And now, she wore the dresses he bought her, ate the food he provided, and slept under a quilt he had ordered for her. She owned nothing. She was nothing. Just help. Just someone he hired because his last housekeeper had up and quit. Mrs. Frost stood, smoothing her skirts again. Well, I really should be going. But do think about what I said, Silas, about the social next month. It would do you good to come to town more often, to show people that everything is proper out here. Just then they heard hoofbeats. Silas rode into the yard. He saw the buggy, and his jaw tightened. He swung down from his horse, tied the reins, and walked toward the porch. Adelaide. His voice was flat and cold. Sarah had never heard him use a tone like that before. Well now, Mrs. Frost offered a sweet smile. Silas, there you are. I was just enjoying a cup of tea with your housekeeper. The way she paused before saying housekeeper was as sharp as a spur. Such a delightful girl. That is mighty kind of you. Well, I ought to be going, but you simply must come to the social. Everybody would be thrilled to see you. She fixed her gaze on Sarah. Her smile turned brittle. And you, my dear, if you find yourself needing anything, a woman to confide in, maybe some advice about your predicament, you come find me in town. Sarah just gave a nod. She couldn't get a single word out. It felt like her throat was squeezed shut. Mrs. Frost made her way down the steps, untied her horse, and settled into the buggy before turning it. The yellow wheels shined in the sun. The red fringe danced. Then she drove off. The buggy vanished down the road, and the dust began to settle. For a long moment, neither Sarah nor Silas moved a muscle. Then he took a seat in the very chair Mrs. Frost had just left, lifted her teacup, and set it back down. The tea inside was only half gone, and cold as a stone by now. He looked straight at Sarah. Did she get under your skin? Sarah just stared down at her own teacup. A tiny crack ran through it, a hairline fracture from the rim all the way to the handle. She had no memory of dropping it, but there it was, broken, just like everything else felt. She stood up, gathered the tray. The cups clattered and tea sloshed over the edges. She took it inside and placed it on the kitchen table, standing there with her palms pressed flat against the wood. The dirt beneath her fingernails was so dark, so ground in. She had scrubbed them raw before making the tea. It did no good. The dirt was just too deep. A permanent part of her now. Silas appeared, leaning against the doorframe. What did she say to you? Sarah just shook her head. She couldn't bring herself to look at him. If she did, she knew she'd see what Mrs. Frost saw. A woman without a name, without a past, with no right to anything, just living in his house, eating his food, wearing his charity, and pretending she was something more. It does not matter. It surely does. If it is bothering you, I am fine. But she was not fine. She was standing in a kitchen that was not hers, inside a house that was not hers, on a ranch that was not hers. For 5 whole weeks, she'd been playing make-believe that this was home, that she had a place here, that she was building a real life. But Mrs. Frost had seen the truth. She was just the help, a woman Silas had hired. And the minute he got tired of her, or found someone better, someone more suitable, she would be right back at some dusty crossroads or a place far worse. She walked right past him, out the back door and into the garden, where she knelt between the basil rows and started yanking out weeds hard and fast. The roots ripped from the earth, dirt flying everywhere. Her hands had started shaking again. She dug in harder, trying to force them to be still. She heard him come outside, heard him sit on the back step. The old wood groaned under his weight. He did not say a word, just sat there. She kept right on working, pulled 3 more weeds, then 4, then 5. Her fingernails snagged on the tough roots. One nail tore clean off and blood started to well up, a thin line of red. She wiped it on her apron and kept right on pulling. She reminded me. Her voice was scratchy and raw. She cleared her throat, but kept her eyes on the weeds, refusing to look at him. Of everything I do not have. She sat back on her heels then. Her hands were filthy, caked in dirt and blood and torn skin. She stared at them. These were the hands of a worker, someone plain and common, someone a woman like Mrs. Frost could look down on with pity. I do not own a single thing here. She finally turned to look at him. He was just watching her. He had his pipe in his hand, but it was not lit. His face was like a closed book. The furniture, the quilt on the bed, the dresses. They are yours. The food I put on the table, it is yours. The house I keep clean, it is yours. She looked back down at her own hands. I am just working here until you do not need me to anymore. There was only silence. The prairie wind whispered through the tall grass. A crow cawed from the peak of the barn roof. Then the step creaked. She heard his boots on the dirt, and he sat down beside the row of basil. Row, not right up on each other. A good 3 feet of Texas dirt sat between them. He kept turning that pipe over and over in his hands. You looking to own a piece of this place? She just stayed quiet. She had no earthly idea how to answer a question like that. Wantin' things was a dangerous game. Wantin' led to hopin', and hopin' meant you had something you could lose. He stood there waiting, the pipe still moving in his hands, the sun beaten down hot on the both of them, and the dark soil laying rich between the rows of green basil. At last, her voice came out, just a little thing, hardly more than a whisper. I don't rightly know if I'm allowed to want something like that. Sarah didn't reply right off. She just kept on pulling weeds. Her torn fingernail was starting to throb something fierce. The bleeding had stopped, but the nail was all ragged. She'd have to file it down later, make it straight. It would probably grow back all crooked. She sat back on her heels and wiped her hands on her apron, leaving behind streaks of red and brown, a mix of dirt and blood. I built my life on promises one time. Her voice was a sight steadier than she figured it would be. She looked at the basil plants instead of at him. It was just easier that way. A man said he'd marry me, said he'd look after me once my father passed on, said I wouldn't have to worry about a thing. She yanked another weed, a small one this time. Its root gave up without a fight. His mother called me common folk, said I wasn't nearly good enough for her boy. He didn't say a word against it. The wedding day rolled around. He never showed. She let the weed fall from her hand, wiped her hands on her apron again. The streaks just got darker. So I don't much know how to want for things anymore. I don't know how to build on promises. They tend to break too easy. A breeze rustled through the tall prairie grass. It was a steady, constant thing. The same wind that had been blowing for weeks, for months, for years before she ever set foot here, and it would keep right on blowing long after she was gone. This time around, I figured I'd just put my head down and work, earn my keep, prove I was worth having around. She stared down at her own hands, at the dirt, the blood, the broken nail. But you gave me that bedroom furniture before I proved a single thing. The quilt, the fabric for my dresses, all of it before I'd done nearly enough to deserve it. She finally lifted her eyes to meet his. He was just watching her, his face all serious, listening to every word and not cutting in. That spooked me more than Adelaide ever did. He waited, didn't rush her, because he knew you were building something. And I've learned that when you build something, it can come tumbling down. And the higher you build it, the harder the fall. The world went quiet for a moment. A crow called out again, but farther off this time. She could hear the ranch hands making noise over in the barn, the sound of hay bales getting moved, a horse snorting. Silas shifted his weight, set his pipe down, and picked up a handful of soil, letting it trickle through his fingers. It was dark and fine, good earth, the kind of soil where things grow strong. I was married once before. Sarah's hand froze. She did not look at him. She just kept staring at the basil leaves. They were bright green with perfect little veins. A fever took her. 3 years ago, this past January, he picked up another handful of dirt. He let it fall. She watched his hands. They were scarred up just like hers. Different kinds of scars, but from the same kind of hard work. She was from town, came from a good family. They all figured I would settle down there, maybe open a shop, buy a house on Main Street, get on the church board. He brushed the dirt from his hands. It all fell away. I thought she would settle down here. He found a small stick and drew a line in the dirt right between them, a straight, careful line. She hated it out here. The loneliness, the quiet, all the endless work. She wanted neighbors close by, wanted to go to church socials every single week, wanted to put on nice dresses and go to all the town gatherings. He drew another line next to the first one, perfectly parallel. We tried for 2 whole years. Both of us were miserable, and both of us were pretending things would get better. He dropped the stick and stared at the 2 lines in the dirt. They did not touch. They never would. She took sick that January. The doctor came all the way from town, but it took him 3 days to get here. By that time, the fever was just too high. He kept his eyes on those lines. She died angry with me. Angry for bringing her to a place she never belonged, for making her live a life she never in her heart wanted. He finally looked right at Sarah, his gaze direct. There was no looking away now. I swore to myself I would not do that to someone ever again. I would not ask a person to try and squeeze into my life. I would not bring somebody here just to have them end up hating me for it. He picked his pipe back up, turning it in his hands. The clay bowl was smooth and worn from use. Then you came along and fixed my wagon wheel without ever asking if I wanted any help. You did not wait for me to beg. You did not wait for my permission. You just saw what needed doing and you did it. He tapped the pipe against his palm, but nothing came out. It was already empty. I was not looking for another wife who would grow to resent me. I was looking for a partner who would stay because she wanted to be here. Not because she felt she had to. Not because of some promise, but because this was the right place for her. The words hung in the air between them. They were heavy, and they were true. There was no taking them back. Sarah pulled another weed. The root on this one was deep. She had to dig around it with her fingers, work it loose from the soil. Her torn nail caught on. A root. She bit down on her lip, but she kept working. The weed finally came free with a big clump of dirt still clinging to it. I am not her, I know that. I do not need church socials. I know. She set the weed down and brushed the dirt from her hands. It did not all come off, it never really did. But if I am going to stay, I mean really stay, then I need to know it is mine too. She looked right at him. His face was weathered from the sun. He had lines around his eyes from squinting into the light, some gray hair at his temples and a scar on his jaw from something. He had never said what. He was not a young man, but neither was she. They had both learned their lessons the hard way. They had both been broken in their own ways. And they had both learned how to get back on their feet. The ranch, the choices we make, the work. Not just the chores in the house, not just the cooking and the cleaning and the mending, but all of it. What exactly are you asking for? A partnership. The word came out clear and strong. A real partnership, not a job, not a charity case. A partnership. He looked at her for a long, careful moment, like he was taking measurements, making dead sure everything was lined up just right before he committed. Then he held out his hand. She looked down at it. There was dirt under his nails, the same as hers. There were scars from barbed wire running across his knuckles. They had calluses from a lifetime of hard work. They were tough, real. They were the hands of a man who built things, fixed things, and made things that were meant to last. She reached out and took his hand. They shook on it. It wasn't soft, wasn't gentle, but hard and firm. It was the way men shake hands when they're striking a deal at the stockyards. The kind of handshake that happens when money changes hands, when deals that truly matter get made. His grip was strong and steady, the rough calluses pressing against her palm. Her hand looked tiny inside of his, but her grip was just as strong as his. Pressure for pressure. Equal partners then. Partners. They held that handshake for 3 seconds, then 4, then 5, before letting go. Sarah's palm tingled where his hand had been. She rubbed it against her thigh, smearing the dirt. She got to her feet, dusting the dirt off her knees. It clung to her dress, her apron, her hands. She was made of dirt now, it seemed, part of the earth and all the things that grow from it. I ought to finish this weeding. He stood up, too, picked his pipe back up, and brushed the loose dirt from his pants. I reckon I should check on the south pasture. Heard some coyotes howling last night. They just stood there, 3 feet apart, with the basil patch between them and the wide open prairie stretching out all around them. The ranch itself spread out like something built to stand the test of time, something worth building on. Then he gave a single nod. He turned around and walked toward the barn. Hetty watched him go, his back straight and his stride long. It was the same walk she'd seen that very first day at the crossroads, when his wagon had come limping toward her with a busted wheel dragging in the dirt. She knelt back down in the garden, grabbed another weed and gave it a pull. The root came out clean. She set it to the side and moved on to the next one. Her hands weren't shaking anymore. That night, she lay in her bed, just staring up at the ceiling. The moonlight coming through the window made the wooden beams look like they were made of silver. She could hear him moving around upstairs, the creak of the floorboards, the sound of water pouring, and his door closing shut. The house settled down into its nightly sounds, the wind, the crickets, and the odd pop coming from the stove as it cooled. She thought about his hand in hers, the way it felt so solid and real, like good iron that's been worked right, hammered and tempered and tested. The kind of hand that holds a partnership, not a marriage, not an employment agreement, but something else entirely, something new. And it was something she was building from the ground up with her own 2 hands, together with his hands. She thought about what Mrs. Frost had said. People will talk. Let 'em talk. Let them think whatever they were going to think. She knew what this was, and so did Silas. That was enough. But knowing what it was and having proof of it were 2 mighty different things. A handshake was a private matter, a hidden thing. Nobody else saw it. Nobody else knew. And if something were to happen, if he got sick, if he died, if his family came from back east claiming this ranch, she would have nothing. No proof, no legal standing, just another woman who worked for a man who had shown her a bit of kindness. She needed more than just a handshake. She needed something legal, something that couldn't be snatched away, something that said she belonged right here, not because he allowed it, but because it was hers by right. Sleep didn't come easy. She was restless. She woke up twice, once from the wind rattling the window pane, and once from a sound she couldn't quite place. Maybe it was a dream, or maybe it was nothing at all. Morning came. She woke up before the sun, like she always did. She built up the fire and put the coffee on. He came downstairs. They worked alongside each other in silence. It was the same old routine, but it felt different now. Everything felt different. After breakfast, he went into his office. She could hear drawers opening and closing, papers shuffling, and the scratch of a pen on paper. It went on like that for an hour, maybe longer. Then he came out and walked into the kitchen where she was kneading bread with flour on, her hands all over the table and on her apron. He was carrying some papers, the official-looking kind, on heavy cream-colored paper. She could see the writing on them, black ink, thick and dense. He set them down on the corner of the table, away from all the flour. "I'll need your signature." She looked from the papers up to him. His face was serious, calm, like a man who had made up his mind and was sure about it. She wiped her hands on her apron, getting most of the flour off. She picked up the papers and read the one on top. Partnership Agreement, Iron Creek Ranch, between Silas Kane and Sarah Hawthorne. She read it real careful. Every single word, every line. It was all legal language, but it was clear enough. Equal partnership in the operation of the ranch, an equal say in all decisions, an equal share of all the profits. If either one of them wanted to dissolve the partnership, the assets would be divided up equal. If one of them died, the other would inherit their share. It wasn't a marriage contract. It wasn't an employment contract. It was a partnership. Legal. Binding. Her hands started to shake again. She set the papers down and pressed her palms flat against the table. A little cloud of flour dust rose up and then settled. This is... She couldn't finish the sentence. She didn't have the words for what this was. He pulled out a chair and sat down. "We'll need to go file it at the courthouse, make it all official. But I wanted you to read it over first. Make sure it says what you want it to say." She picked the papers up one more time. She read them even slower now. Every clause, every provision. Her name was right there, written plain as day in his own hand. Sarah Hawthorne. Partner, when did you write this? Last night. After we had our talk. Last night. While she had been lying awake, wondering if a simple handshake was ever going to be enough. He'd been upstairs writing this, making it real, making it permanent. Why? He looked straight at her. He had that direct way of looking that seemed to see right through everything, straight to whatever was true. Because a handshake is private. This is public. This says you own half of everything here. Not because I'm being kind, not because you're a hard worker, because you are my partner, legal and equal. If something happens to me, this ranch is yours. It can't be taken away from you. It can't be questioned. Her throat got all tight. She swallowed hard. Then she swallowed again. The papers went blurry. She blinked her eyes. They cleared up. I don't know what to say. Say if it's right, if it's what you want. She read it one last time. The words hadn't changed a bit. Partnership. Right beside the papers. Sign it, then right beside the papers. Sign it, then. She dipped the pen into the ink. The nib came up black. She tapped it against the rim of the bottle once, then twice, and then she signed her name. Her handwriting was smaller than his, neater. She formed each letter with care. Sarah Hawthorne, partner. The ink was still wet, shining on the page. She set the pen down. She didn't blow on the ink to dry it. She just let it be. Silas signed his name right below hers as the witness. Then he wrote down the date. September 15th, 1882. 3.5 months. That's all it had been since that crossroads, since the broken wheel, since she'd climbed up into his wagon with nothing to her name but a carpetbag and 19 cents. Now she owned half a ranch. He folded the papers and stood up. I'll take these into town on Monday. Get 'em filed proper. She just nodded. She couldn't speak. If she tried to speak, she knew something would break open deep inside her chest, and she'd never be able to close it back up again. He left, going back outside. She heard the door close behind him. She just stood there with flour on the table, the bread dough still waiting, her hands shaking so hard she had to grip the edge of the table to steady them. Partnership. Legal, real, and hers. She looked down at her hands. They were still dirty, still scarred, and still marked by hard work. But now they were the hands of a woman who owned something, of a woman who belonged somewhere. They were the hands of a woman who had built something that was meant to last. She went back to kneading the bread dough. It felt soft and elastic under her palms. She pushed it, folded it, and pushed it again. The steady rhythm calmed her nerves, the familiar motion, the smell of yeast and flour, the warmth coming from the stove, it all helped. By the time the bread was left to rise, she had stopped shaking. That afternoon, she was back out in the garden. The basil was ready for harvesting. She cut the tops and left the stems. They would grow back. That is just how basil works. You cut it, and it grows back even stronger. She heard hoofbeats and looked up. Silas was riding back from the south pasture. He saw her and gave a nod. She nodded back. It was the same as every other day, the same old routine. But now, everything was different. That evening, they sat on the porch after the dishes were done. He smoked his pipe. She mended a shirt. The crickets started their nightly song. The sun dipped below the horizon. The sky turned from orange to purple, and then to black. He was the first to speak. You want to go for a walk tomorrow? The creek is running good after last week's rain. Yes. It was just that simple, that easy. They were partners, thinking about what came next. The night sky was packed with stars, so bright and thick she could make out the Milky Way, like a splash of cream across black velvet. She finished her sewing, folded the shirt neatly, and placed it in the basket. It was getting late, and she knew she ought to get some sleep. Silas agreed, and they headed back inside. He turned the key in the lock while she held the lamp high. When they reached the stairs, they went their separate ways. He went on up to his room, and she turned into hers. She shut the door behind her and put the lamp down on the little washstand. Her eyes swept across the room. taking in the furniture, the handmade quilt, the braided rug, and the apron hanging from a peg on the wall. Every last thing belonged to her now. It was not a loan, and it was not a gift. It was hers. She sat on the edge of the bed and worked off her boots. Her feet were clean for once. She had washed them good before supper, scrubbing away all the grime. They still carried the faint smell of sage, a scent that seemed to soak right into your skin and stay there. She slid under the covers, pulling the quilt up to her chin. It was a wedding ring pattern, hundreds of them, stitched perfectly in blue and cream. She laid her palm flat against it, feeling the texture of the fabric, the hours of work, the love sewn into every stitch. Tomorrow, they would walk down to the creek and lay out their plans for the spring planting. They would talk about making the garden bigger and building a chicken coop large enough for a few more hens. It was all the little things that, when put together, made a life. A real one. A life she was building with her own two hands. She closed her eyes, listening to the steady tick of her father's watch. It was a dependable sound, the same rhythm it had held for 20 years. Iron does not put on a show, he always used to say. It just is. She was finally starting to understand what he meant. She was learning how to just be, without having to pretend or perform for anyone, simply living as herself. Sarah Hawthorne, a partner, an owner, a woman who could mend what was broken and build what would last. Sleep came to her easily that night, a deep and dreamless rest. When she woke up, the coffee would already be brewing, the bread dough would be rising, and a whole day's work would be waiting for her. It was the same as always, the same familiar rhythm, the same partnership. But now, when folks in town started whispering, or when Mrs. Frost gave her that cold smile, there was a difference. If anyone ever questioned if Sarah belonged here, there were papers down at the courthouse that said she did. They were legal, they were binding, and they were permanent. She belonged here because she had earned her place, because she had built it from the ground up, and because it was hers. 3 weeks went by. The partnership papers were officially filed at the courthouse. Sarah's name was recorded in the county ledgers right next to Silas's, equal owners of the Iron Creek Ranch. They had ridden into town that Monday just like he said they would, and walked straight into the courthouse together to file the document. The clerk had peered at them over the top of his spectacles. He read the whole thing through, looked up at Sarah, then over at Silas, and stamped it without saying a word. He filed it away in the enormous leather book where all the property records were kept. As they were walking out, they saw Mrs. Frost on the boardwalk. She saw them coming, and a smile started to form on her face, but then it vanished. Something about the way they walked together, side by side, neither one in front of the other, gave her pause. She just gave a stiff nod and hurried on her way. No nosy questions, no snide remarks. The news got around, not like a wildfire, but slow and steady, the way things do in a small town. By Thursday, the man who owned the mercantile was asking Sarah for her opinion on what winter stock he should order. By Saturday, the town banker tipped his hat to her right, there on the street. By the second week, nobody questioned her place anymore. Sarah Hawthorne was a partner, a landowner, a woman who had fixed a busted wagon wheel and carved out a life for herself from nothing but dirt, hard work, and the help of one man who was willing to see her for who she truly was. Now it was October. The terrible heat of summer had finally broken. The mornings were crisp and cool. The prairie grass had changed from green to a beautiful shade of gold. The garden was almost completely harvested. Rows of canned tomatoes lined the pantry shelves. Bunches of dried herbs like basil and sage and thyme hung from the kitchen beams, filling the whole house with their wonderful smell. Sarah woke up before the sun, just like always, but it felt easier these days. The mattress no longer made her back ache. The room did not feel so empty and quiet anymore. Her dresses were hanging in the wardrobe. She had 3 of them now, a brown one, a gray one, and a brand new blue one she had sewn herself from fabric Silas had bought her in town. Her father's old leather apron was still hanging crookedly on the wall. She had looked at it just yesterday, running her fingers over the cracked leather and the old burn marks, but she left it right where it was. Some things just do not need to be fixed. She went downstairs and started a fire in the stove. It caught right away. She had figured out the perfect amount of kindling it needed, and just how to place the log so the draft would pull through it just right. The coffee was already boiling by the time she heard his footsteps creaking on the floorboards above. He came downstairs, poured himself a mug, and stood near the warmth of the stove. She cracked some eggs into a hot skillet. He started slicing the bread. Their hands moved around each other in a familiar, easy way, practiced and efficient. Not a single wasted motion. They ate their breakfast. He read the Gazette from the day before. She gazed out the window. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the horizon with orange light. The prairie seemed to stretch on forever. This was home. He set down the paper after folding it neatly. What needs fixing? She had already been thinking about it. The porch rail is still a bit loose. I have been meaning to mention it. I will see to it today. He finished his coffee and set the cup down. What else? Else? What would you change? This house is yours too. What would you like to see different? She let her gaze wander around the kitchen. The windows were bare and the walls were plain. Everything was useful and clean, but it was all very stark. Curtains, maybe, for the front room. He nodded his head. What kind did you have in mind? Something simple, nothing too fancy, just something to block the sun in the afternoons. Do you want to pick them out, or should I order some from the catalog? I can pick them. Next time we go to town, then. We will go on Friday. It was always we now, not I. After breakfast, he went outside to fix the porch rail. She could hear him hammering, the sound of new wood replacing the old solid boards that would not rot for many years. She washed the dishes, took a look in the pantry, and started a list of what they would need to get through the winter. Flour, sugar, coffee, salt, beans, and cornmeal. The list kept getting longer. She would show it to Silas later on. They would place the order together, decide on everything together, like partners. Around mid-morning, he came back inside. Feel like taking a walk? She looked up from the bread dough she was kneading. Where to? Down to the creek. The water is running real good. We have not been down that way in a while. She covered the dough with a clean cloth and wiped the flour from her hands. Yes. They walked out of the house together, past the barn, where the 3 ranch hands were busy mucking out the stalls. They went past the corral where the horses were standing and dozing in the warm sunlight. They crossed the yard and went through the north pasture. The grass there was tall, with heavy seed heads. The stalks brushed against Sarah's skirt, leaving little bits of chaff clinging to the fabric. The ground was rough and uneven, dotted with prairie dog holes and gopher mounds. So she had to watch her step. The sun was warm on her skin, but it was not hot. The air smelled of dried grass and dust and the great wide open spaces. A hawk circled high above them, riding the warm air currents. Its shadow swept over them for a moment and then was gone. Soon the creek came into view. Iron Creek was about 20 feet across. The water was shallow, so clear and cold you could see it running over the smooth stones on the bottom. On the east bank, a line of young willow trees stood, probably about 10 years old. Their leaves were just starting to change from green to a lovely golden yellow. They sat down together on the bank. The grass was soft, packed down flat by the cattle that came there to drink. The water made a quiet, constant burbling sound. It was the same sound it had made for countless years and would continue to make for many more to come. Sarah picked up a stone. It was gray and smooth, worn round by the current. She turned it over and over in her hand. Why do they call it Iron Creek? Silas leaned back on his hands and looked out at the water. Found some iron ore deposits. When I purchased this land, a whole vein of it runs right under us. Goes way down deep. He scooped up a stone of his own and tossed it out into the water. It made a soft plunk when it hit. The ripples spread out and then disappeared. A fellow named Air came all the way from Denver to test it, and he said there was iron down there for sure. Good iron, too, but not enough to make a real profit from mining it. He said it would cost more to get it out of the ground than it was even worth. Silas wiped his hands on his trousers. Most fellas would have been mighty disappointed. Me, I was relieved. Why? Because it meant the iron could just stay put. We did not have to put it to use. We did not have to dig it all up. Just the knowing that it was deep in the earth was enough for me. He gave her a look that spoke of value that exists without ever being taken. She understood completely, thinking of her father's iron stock. All those bars and rods and sheets he never once used. He just kept them, just in case. The simple fact of having it was enough. The knowledge, the presence. What are you fixin' to plant come spring? She considered it. More of everything. Beans, squash, tomatoes, and maybe some corn if we can figure out how to keep the crows away. More herbs, too, the medicinal kind. Feverfew, chamomile, things we can actually use. You want a bigger garden plot? Yes, twice the size of what I have now. I will have the men turn over the soil in March. Get it all ready for you. They sat together. The creek just kept on flowing. The sun kept on climbing higher in the sky. The shadows got shorter and then began to stretch out long again. "Do you ever get to thinking about leaving?" he asked. The question did not catch her off guard. She had pondered it herself sometimes, late in the night. When the wind howled and the old house creaked, when the feeling of being all alone pressed in on her. No. Do you? No. He picked up another stone from the ground. He did not throw this one. He just held it in his palm. But you could, you know. The papers are all legal. You own half of this place. You could sell your share. Take the money and go anywhere you ever wanted to. I know. I just want to be sure that you know you can. She looked over at him. His face was serious, honest. He truly meant it. He was not trying to test her. He was not making a threat. He was just stating a fact. I do not want to. He nodded, then set the stone back down on the ground. Good. They sat there for a long while. They sat. The comfortable kind of quiet. The kind that happens when two people just plain understand one another. When words are not needed. When just being there is all that matters. A coyote howled somewhere off to the west. Another one answered it. The sound drifted across the open prairie. It was a wild, lonely, and beautiful sound. Sarah got to her feet and brushed the grass from her skirt. Silas stood up too. They walked back together through the tall grass, going past the corrals and the big barn, and into the main yard. The house looked white in the afternoon sun, though the paint was still peeling off at the corners. She had brought up the idea of repainting. He had said, next summer. They would do it together. They would even pick out the color together. Probably white again. But it would be their choice, their decision. They paused at the bottom of the porch steps. The new handrail gleamed, made of light-colored wood, freshly cut and solid. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For asking me what needs fixing around here. It is your house, too. It ought to be the way you want it. And not just the house, but the ranch, the life, all of it." It was hers, and it was theirs. Something built together from broken wagon wheels and dirt and good, honest work. She climbed the steps. He followed right behind her. They went on inside. The house smelled of baking bread. The dough had risen while they were out. She formed it into loaves and set them in the oven to bake. The warmth from the oven filled the kitchen. It felt good. He took a seat at the table, opened the ledger book, and started making entries. She worked near him, peeling potatoes for their supper. They had built this companionable silence, piece by piece, day by day, week by week. That evening they ate their meal at the table, bread fresh out of the oven, with butter, and the very last of the tomatoes from the garden. It was simple food, but it was good food. They talked about the cattle, about which ones they ought to sell and which ones to keep for breeding. They talked about the fence line that needed checking and about ordering supplies before the first snow fell. Small plans, real plans, the kind of plans a person can actually keep. After they finished the dishes, they sat out on the porch. The new rail felt smooth under her hand. He smoked his pipe. She did some mending. The crickets were singing loud and insistent. It was a fall sound, different from the summer, more urgent, as if they knew their time was running short. The stars started to pop out, thick and bright. She could see everything so clearly. The Big Dipper, the belt of Orion rising up, and the Milky Way looking like a river of light spilled across the black sky. "Are you happy here?" he asked. She kept on stitching, the needle catching the starlight and flashing like silver, in and out, making something torn whole again. Yes, it was just one word, but it held everything inside it. The crossroads, the broken wheel, the empty room, the furniture, the quilt, the ledger that had her name in it, the partnership papers, the garden, the creek, and the iron deep beneath the ground, all of it. Me too. They sat. The night grew deeper and colder. She finished her mending, folded the shirt, and placed it in her basket. I should get to sleep. Me too. They went back inside. He locked the front door. She carried the oil lamp. At the bottom of the stairs, they went their separate ways. He went on up. She went into her room. She closed her door and set the lamp down on the washstand. Her father's old watch was sitting beside the porcelain pitcher, ticking away, steady as ever. She wound it 13 turns, just like she always did. She glanced around the room. Everything was in its proper place, and everything was hers. The bed, the wardrobe, the rug, even the apron hanging a little crooked on the wall. She walked over to the apron and touched the leather straps. They were cracked and burned, but they were real. The smell of smoke and iron and hard work still lingered faintly in the grain. "I did it, Papa," she whispered to herself. "I built something, something that is going to hold." She sat down on the edge of the bed and pulled off her boots. The quilt felt smooth beneath her hands, a pattern of wedding rings, hundreds of them, in blue and cream, with perfect stitching. She lay down and pulled the quilt up over her. The fabric was soft from so many washings, worn in all the right places. It was loved, used, and real. She closed her eyes and just listened. The house settling for the night, the wind blowing outside. Silas moving around upstairs, his door closing softly. Her father's watch ticking. All the familiar sounds, the sounds of her home. Tomorrow she would wake up before the dawn, build the fire, and start the coffee. He would come downstairs, and they would work side by side. It was the same routine, the same partnership, building something one day at a time, something that was meant to last. She thought about that crossroads, 4 months ago, which felt like a whole lifetime ago, with 3 roads splitting off. Her just sitting there with absolutely nothing, no direction, no hope, only dust and heat and a whole lot of emptiness. She had chosen the East Road, or maybe it had chosen her. Whichever way it was, she was here now. Not because she had nowhere else to turn, but because this was the place where she truly belonged. Partnership, ownership, a home. Iron does not perform. Her father always used to say that. It just is. She had finally learned what he meant, how to just be without pretending, without putting on a show, just existing as herself. Sarah Hawthorne, partner, owner, a woman who fixed broken things and built new things that lasted. Sleep came to her easily. A deep sleep, the kind that only comes when you know exactly where you belong, when you know you have earned it, and when you know it is yours. The very last thing she heard was her father's watch, ticking, steady, and reliable, marking the time, and building hours into days, and days into weeks, and weeks into a life. A life that she had built with her own 2 hands, with dirt and work, and with one man's willingness to see her for who she was, to stand beside her, and to build something together that would surely hold. There is a certain kind of quiet that settles over you when a story like this one comes to an end. It is not exactly relief, and it is not quite satisfaction. It is just that familiar weight of knowing that some things cannot be fixed with simple promises, but only with time and with work that is done side by side. A lot of us have stood at our own crossroads in life. Maybe not with 3 dusty roads and a wedding ring lying in the dirt, but with that same hollow feeling of not knowing which way to turn. And maybe some of us learn, just like Sarah did, that the very best partnerships are not built on being rescued or on romance, but on competence and mutual respect, on two people who see each other plain as day and make the choice to stay anyway. We do not always get the big dramatic ending. Sometimes it is just coffee at dawn and hands that know where everything goes. Sometimes it is a partnership paper filed away at the courthouse and a garden plot that needs to be turned over come spring. Small things, real things, the kind of things that hold. It is all right if this story does not tie up in a neat little bow. Life rarely ever does. Sarah still has dirt under her fingernails. The paint on the house is still peeling at the corners, but she owns half of a ranch now, and that is enough. That is more than enough. Thank you for sitting a spell with Sarah and Silas these past few weeks, for staying with them through the quiet parts, and for listening all the way to the end.